My feature guest this morning is a senior anaesthetist at Hawke's Bay Hospital, although that is not why we've invited him onto the program. Peter Lloyd recently gave a public lecture in the Bay, not about his field of expertise, but about the much bigger question of what happens if we all continue to live as if there will always be unlimited supplies of oil, water and fertile soil. What happens if we don't address the issue of climate change and environmental degradation? What then? Peter Lloyd has spent months reading expert opinions on all of this, and there are now literally thousands of very eminent scientists scratching their heads over the issues. And he's come to the conclusion that at the very least, we all need to be talking about it. So we will. Peter Lloyd joins me now. Good morning to you.
Good morning, Linda.
Tell me what got you interested in doing so much reading about this.
Christmas time 2004 on national radio, there was a series called A Short History of Progress by Ronald Wright. This was a series of Massey lectures published by the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation and rebroadcast by our own national radio. And the information that I learnt from that was an absolute revelation to me. What Ronald Wright really did was he showed us that many of the previous civilizations of the world behaved in exactly the same stereotypical way, and that in fact we as a global civilization are behaving in an identical way to the way those previous failed civilizations had performed in the past.
When you say the way they'd performed, I mean in a similar way, what way are we talking about?
Well, the first thing that happened was when Neolithic, that is Stone Age peoples, learnt how to hunt, they reached what was called a progress trap, which is that they got so good at hunting that they actually destroyed the animals that they were hunting. And so those people either learnt to moderate their hunting and live in some sort of equilibrium with nature, and you can think of the Inuit in the north as an example of that, or they switched to agriculture, or at least the ones that survived switched to agriculture. Now the trouble with agriculture is it permitted an increase in the population, which meant that there was no way of turning back to a more primitive lifestyle.
Just pause, because this is complicated and we're joining the dots. When it permitted an increase in the population because why? There was more food, people were better fed.
There was more food available, but it also necessitated clearing of forests to make land available for agriculture. So then you entered a spiral whereby the population continually and continuously increased. Land use became more and more intense until eventually there was a collapse of the soil. The soil started to lose fertility. There was a problem with build-up of pollution in the fresh water sources for the people. And ultimately the soil withered away and died, and with it the population, they either were able to move away and start the whole sorry cycle again, or if they couldn't move away, as in the case of, for example, the people that lived in Easter Island, they suffered a massive population decline, approximately 90% in Easter Island, and what was left was a starving remnant of what had formerly been quite a grand civilization.
And then there was this other development, which was, I guess, more sophisticated agriculture. So then you fertilized the ground, and that meant you didn't have to move on.
Well, the Sumerian civilization did that. They had the most wonderfully elaborate irrigation scheme. The Sumerian civilization was the earliest modern civilization. It occupied the land which is now southern Iraq. And the problem with that intense irrigation in a hot environment is that salt levels build up in the soil, and in fact the southern part of Iraq now is literally a sandy desert because the soil was no longer able to support the growth of crops, and the population that the land was able to support was considerably diminished.
So in the past, when cultures, populations made these mistakes, these miscalculations with the environment on which they depended, they either were wiped out almost, or they moved elsewhere. You would say what's happening now is a preparation for some kind of clearing out?
Well, The problem is that our civilization now is a global civilization. We're hunting everywhere, we're fishing everywhere, we're drawing waters from aquifers everywhere, and the ecosystem of the entire world is already showing signs of degradation. But there is, unfortunately, and this is another thing that was illustrated by Ronald Wright, humans have very poor capacity to face up to and cope with problems which are not immediate. We're wonderfully clever when it comes to solving problems that are immediate, but we seem to have a collective blindness when it comes to problems which are slightly more remote, even if those problems have a probability level of almost 100%. I'll just give you an example that Professor Jay Callahan gave on national radio a couple of weeks ago. He said if you see a child climbing on the railing on the Cook Strait ferry, you would imagine that there's a probability that the child might slip and fall to his death. And anyone would do something about it immediately. But now we have thousands of scientists around the world telling us that we are heading towards a very high probability of disaster. And the three elephants that are sitting in our living room and that we're pretending not to notice are global oil depletion, climate change, and global overpopulation. And so we have a very high probability of disaster because of those three factors, either individually or probably as a collision of factors happening all at the same time. And yet collectively we don't seem to be doing anything about it.
Do you, I mean, in all of your reading, is it possible to see any kind of consensus emerging among the scientists about when this might happen and what we would need to do about it?
I think from my reading there has been an increasing level of consensus and alarm over the last few years. When climate change was first announced, there was a healthy degree of skepticism amongst scientists. But I think that now that skepticism has almost evaporated like Lake Chad is evaporating. It's almost gone. There are one or two people who deliberately take up a contrary position for reasons of their own, but they number in, the single digits. But we're talking about literally thousands of scientists, and these are the best educated people in the world who are telling us that this is the problem that we're facing and we have to do something about it.
But there isn't any such consensus in the public debate, is there? I mean, we can't, for instance, get politicians yet to agree if there's even something that they need to begin dealing with.
No. Well, I think this is the process of human collective blindness in action. I was astonished during the last election that only one of the political parties even acknowledged that we had a problem, and that none of the parties seemed to even be able to contemplate the possibility that the oil might run out or that environmental degradation was happening on a global scale around the world.
Well, there is an assumption, is there not, that somehow we've got so much more clever than we were last time the world faced a problem anything like this. And so somehow this time round science will be able to save us.
That's grasping at straws. I mean, I'd love it to be true, Linda. And in fact, most of the things that we need to survive have already been invented and have already been implemented in a number of countries. The trouble is that the collective will to put it all together and to change our lifestyle from one which is consuming the Earth's resources to one which is living sustainably with the capability of the Earth to provide services such as fresh water, fresh air and fertile soils. We just don't seem to be doing that.
Well, let's talk about these three things separately. Oil depletion first and foremost. How long is there a consensus emerging from the science point of view about how long before the oil starts running out?
I think the people who really know are the geologists, and they range from a man called Professor Kenneth DeFays, who stated on the 11th of February that we have already started oil depletion. We reached the peak on the 16th of December 2005. Now, Professor DeFays is quite an outspoken sort of guy, but he is a professor of geology at Princeton University, so he's a serious heavyweight in the scientific field. Another man such as Dr. Jeremy Leggett estimates that we're going to hit global peak oil production in 2008, plus or minus 2 years. So I think the reality is that we will only know for sure about reaching peak oil and oil depletion from the rear view mirror.
Yeah.
And the reason for that is that the majority of people that own the big oil fields, such as the Saudis and the Kuwaitis and the Russians, will not allow independent geologists to make accurate measurements of how much oil they actually have left. So the only way we'll know for sure is by looking at the global energy or oil production in the world, and when that starts to fall, we will know that we have reached peak oil. But it is happening fairly close to now. I've read one report said that oil production declined by 1% last year. I've read another report by Kenneth DeFays that in fact oil production increased by 0.8% last year. But I don't think we're seeing global oil production expanding to meet the continuing expansion in global oil demands, which is why the price of oil has been rising very dramatically in the recent years.
And the production is only one side of that equation anyway, isn't it? Because in terms of like finding new oil, because this is the way, if the existing places we get oil are running out, then the optimists will say, but it'll be found somewhere else. But in fact, you told the public meeting that the last year we discovered more oil than we burnt was way back in 1980.
That's right. In fact, the peak of oil discovery was 1964, when I was 3 years old. And so the whole world has been searched over and over again. The last time we discovered what is called a giant oil field, and the definition of a giant is something with more than 500 million barrels of oil, I think we discovered 6 in 2000, 4 in 2001, 1 in 2002, and there haven't been any giant oil field discoveries since then. And I would point out, Linda, that a giant oil field provides enough oil for 1 week of consumption. So we just are not able to find any more oil. There isn't any.
But equally, there is, for all of these warning signs, there is no sign that our addiction to oil is abating.
I think we are starting to use less oil. The Europeans certainly are tending to buy smaller and more fuel-efficient cars. Even the Americans are starting to talk about their addiction to oil and trying to reduce it. I don't really see it. I don't actually see us voluntarily reducing our oil consumption in a meaningful way. I think it's going to be imposed on us by the failure to pump more oil. I think it's important to point out that approximately 2 trillion barrels of oil were left behind after geological processes millions of years ago. And Professor DeFay's estimate of peak oil on the 16th of December was when he estimated that we passed the 1 trillion barrel mark, which is, for mathematical reasons, assumed to be the time at which peak oil is going to occur. The other thing, of course, is the amount of energy necessary to get a barrel of oil. When the Americans started and oil was literally gushing out of the ground, you got approximately 28 barrels of oil for every barrel of oil of energy expended in trying to exploit it. What's happening now is that it's only about 2 barrels for every barrel of oil. And so you're getting into a more and more unfavorable energy return on energy investment situation.